as this series has shown, the rules are pretty basic. With practice, you'll need to think about the rules themselves less and less. Just like any other skill, the principles are one thing, but getting the most out of them, applying those principles, is really a different question completely. So in this video, we're going to take a look at the language of composition through making choices like viewpoint and the direction of the sun. I am using a 3D render, but you could just as simply draw this. And since we know how to draw in perspective, the question now becomes, well, what angle should we draw the object from? So you can see here, this side view tells us very little about the form of the cup. For instance, I have no idea what's inside of this cup. This other angle here shows that it's a coffee cup. You can see the coffee inside. Now, from a technical standpoint, there's really no difference. Drawing one is just as easy as drawing the other. But if I've changed my viewpoint by raising it up a bit here, I can tell a lot more about the object. So each of those have their own merits, but you have to know which one you want to do. The end result is either more or less descriptive about the coffee itself. Now, the shadow direction is important as well, because if you're to just reduce this image down to black and white, the shape of the shadow is actually pretty large in this composition. Generally, I think it's a bad idea to have the light source behind a single object. Here you can see the shadows being cast towards the viewer, and what happens here is it obscures most of the details because they're lost in shadow. And also it just has this big shadow shape that sort of dominates the composition. Now, this could work to your advantage sometimes, but often it's a distraction. Here you can see the shadow is less of a distraction, though it's still creating a large graphic shape. Now, I've moved the camera to a sharp down shot, and that makes the cup itself much more confusing. It's kind of hard to tell what shape the cup is. But then you look at the shadow itself, and you get much more information about the cup. It's this sort of elongated shape reference for what the cup looks like. You've probably seen a technique just like this in monster movies. This last one here is my favorite though, because the cast shadow helps describe the form of the cup. It also pops out the handle, the way the contrast is surrounding the light and shadow, but the shadow is not dominating the image. You could call the shadow angle here descriptive, but it still leaves the cup at center stage. You're not looking at a big shadow shape and, oh yeah, a little cup over there. So when you're lighting your scene, keep in mind what the shadow is going to say in your image. You want the shadow working for you, not against. And just like choosing a viewpoint, there's really no technical difference. Once you know how to draw a shadow, drawing it in any different direction is just as easy. So it comes down to a series of smart choices. Let's apply these same concepts to a more complicated city scene. So the first of these two are very different angles. There's sort of a low angle and a very high angle, and they tell really different stories. If you have an upshot, a sort of low angle like this, it does a good job putting your audience in the scene. It's a standard view that you're used to seeing on a daily basis. But a down shot like this is almost like you're in a helicopter, and it's really great for explaining the layout of a scene. It also feels a bit less emotionally involved. It's more of like a diagram of the scene, and the viewer feels very removed from it. But it does a good job showing the geographical layout. Now, with these next two, you can see that I've moved the perspective points closer to the composition, giving it this distorted, wide-angle look. So this can be good if you're doing it on purpose. It exaggerates the sense of depth. So it can be useful, but if you push it too far, here you can see there's some strange results around the edges. But in the case of this extreme upshot where I'm looking from street view way up at these tall buildings, it really does give a good sense of height and depth. Finally, we're going to apply these same ideas to a larger and more complicated sci-fi scene, one that's got some stand-in characters. So in this first one, you can see there's a nice sense of depth. It's not a very exaggerated angle. The perspective points are far away off the composition. And you can see there's a nice sense of foreground, middle ground, and background. And the height of the characters does a good job explaining how much depth is in this image. I know that the guy up front is probably about 6 feet tall, so the people in the upper left-hand corner are relatively far away. Here I've moved to a different part of the scene, and I've got characters in the extreme foreground, and they're standing next to sort of a railing, and then down below them are some other people in the background. Once again, this has a good sense of foreground, middle ground, and background. And I'm also not using very extreme perspective in this image. The perspective points are reasonably far away from the composition. So this here is more of like an establishing shot. You might use this to describe what this whole space looks like to the viewer before you push in for close shots. And as you can see, this is almost like a one-point perspective because I've got the vanishing point straight in the middle of the composition, and everything points straight at it. Here we're raised up a bit. This is sort of a descriptive camera angle, once again to give a sense of the space itself. It feels a bit emotionally removed. You're not really right in the action, but it does a good job to just sort of explain the layout. Now I've moved the viewpoint even higher, and this is a bit more like that helicopter shot. It does a great job at explaining the layout of the scene, but feels a bit emotionally removed. And finally here, this is a straight down shot. And at this point, it goes from being descriptive to being pretty confusing. Unless you knew what this scene already looked like, a shot like this would not tell you very much. So there may be a time and place to use this kind of a camera angle, but use it cautiously because, as you can see, the end result is sort of abstract. Now, as you move forward as an artist, perspective is going to feel less and less like a burden. It'll just be kind of like breathing. So you'll stop worrying so much about technique and really start worrying more about compositional choice, storytelling, because these are the things that a viewer is really going to see. They're not going to care so much about your ability to draw in perspective. It's just assumed that you know how to do that. But once you get the hang of that stuff, it becomes really exciting to just think about the language of story. Because after all, that's really what illustration is all about.